Welcome everyone to Ratioed. My name is Harrison Faulkner. Well, Danielle Smith's Alberta Sovereignty Act officially passed on Thursday, and for the past month, it has been exploding leftist heads across the country, particularly in Ottawa, where all the right people, I'm talking the federal cabinet, Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, and the Laurentian legacy media, have all been losing it over a province asserting its constitutional control over provincial jurisdiction. On the show, we're going to go through some of the best examples of legacy media journalists losing control over themselves, not able to handle the fact that a province outside of Quebec and Ontario is daring to assert provincial jurisdiction. They just can't control themselves. They just don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. Also, we're going to discuss this very sad, very pathetic attempt to try and protest the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And thanks to the biased coverage of the Alberta Sovereignty Act, we're going to go through what the act is and what the act isn't, because thanks to the journalists, there is a lot of confusion out there about what is really inside the Alberta Sovereignty Act. What version of the bill got passed on Thursday and what didn't, because that seems to be the objective now. The objective now, at least from my perspective, is let's just confuse everyone as much as possible to try and demonize this bill, to try and demonize the Alberta government as much as possible so that no one really knows what is actually going on. We're going to go through all of that and more on the show. The common question for the episode is this. In your mind, is the Alberta Sovereignty Act justified? All right, let's get into it. Well, despite the full court press put on by the legacy media, the Liberals in Ottawa, and the NDP to demonize the Alberta Sovereignty Act and to demonize Danielle Smith, the Sovereignty Act passed the third and final reading in the legislature 27-7. A significant number of NDP MLAs just decided not to vote, it turns out. But the bill finally passed third and final reading, and the Sovereignty Act now awaits royal assent. Now, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of confusion out there as to what the Alberta Sovereignty Act is and what the Alberta Sovereignty Act isn't, and I believe that's intentional from the legacy media. The legacy media, in my opinion, have been trying to paint the bill as something that it isn't, to try and make it out to seem like it's some grand constitutional overreach, like it's some major constitutional violation. Now, why don't we just go through what the Alberta government describes is in the bill that got passed on Thursday. The Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act will only be used when Alberta's Legislative Assembly debates and passes a motion that identifies a specific federal program or piece of legislation as unconstitutional or causing harm to Albertans. The government will ensure constitutional and legal requirements are met before steps are taken to respond. Government will respect court decisions if a response is challenged successfully in court. Now, the government also lays out what the Alberta Sovereignty Act isn't, thanks to legacy media coverage which seems to have only confused Canadians. The Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act will not allow Alberta to defy Canada's constitution. It will not allow Alberta to separate from Canada. It will not allow Cabinet to issue unconstitutional orders in council, including giving instructions that are outside of provincial jurisdiction to provincial entities. And it will not allow Cabinet to give instructions to private individuals or corporations that aren't provincial entities to violate federal law. And it isn't just the Alberta government that have now introduced legislation like this. Saskatchewan also have introduced similar legislation to try and combat against Justin Trudeau's federal government. The Saskatchewan government call it the Saskatchewan First Act, and it was first drafted in early November. It's important to read how the government themselves describe the legislation, because if you take it from the Laurentian legacy media, well, as you'll see, you're going to get a confused and most likely not accurate description of what's in the bill. So here's how the Saskatchewan government described this piece of legislation. The Act amends the Constitution of Saskatchewan to clearly confirm Saskatchewan's sovereign autonomy and asserts Saskatchewan's exclusive legislative jurisdiction under the Constitution of Canada over a number of areas, including the exploration of non-renewable natural resources, the development, conservation, and management of non-renewable natural and forestry resources, and the operation of sites and facilities for the generation and production of electrical energy. As you can see, both Saskatchewan and Alberta have drafted legislation to try and combat what they consider to be an overreaching federal government, a government that they feel has consistently sidestepped provincial jurisdiction to impose on them federal government policies that they feel are not in the best interests of their provinces. Now, critics of the Alberta Sovereignty Act have stuck to three main arguments to oppose the act. The three main arguments are that, one, they consider it to be unconstitutional. The second is that they believe the Alberta Sovereignty Act doesn't respect Indigenous rights and treaties. And finally, critics of the Alberta Sovereignty Act are labeling it as a political trap to try and bait Justin Trudeau and the Liberals into a political dogfight in the province. Now, surely, the Alberta Sovereignty Act and similar legislation, which will likely come up across the country, can't come as much of a surprise to the federal government and the Laurentian legacy media. After all, where do you start with why perhaps Albertans are so fed up with Ottawa? Anti-oil, anti-pipeline, leave it in the ground liberal laws have destroyed oil sands production over the past few years. The government has crippled LNG exports coming out of the province. Ottawa has been imposing emissions reduction targets on fertilizer and LNG. Years of uneven and unfair healthcare and equalization payments has planted the seed of frustration and alienation in the province, which has led to the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And lastly, what about an unconstitutional federal gun grab on hunting rifles? I can't imagine why Albertans would want to have a Sovereignty Act to protect their best interests. For weeks now, the Laurentian legacy media have deployed their very best propagandists to try to spin the Alberta Sovereignty Act and to make it seem as though it's some grand plot to form a breakaway state, to form a legislative coup. It's embarrassing how desperate they are to try and paint this as something that it isn't. Just look at the way this CBC journalist describes the Alberta Sovereignty Act and how the Premier is shunning democracy. He can't control himself. He's begging the federal government to do something before the bill has even passed. If the federal government is basically telling you to calm down and relax, then you've really gone a bit too far here. But after all, I bet you that's exactly what they want of David Cochrane.
Danielle Smith is coming under fire for shunning democracy. Her long-promised Sovereignty Act is supposed to shield the province from federal laws, but it also contains sweeping new powers for her cabinet, including the power to change provincial laws without going through the legislature. But on its face, you have a piece of legislation that allows a province to ignore federal law, compel a string of provincial agencies to essentially do the same. I mean, when you look at its intention, I mean, how is that acceptable in the Canadian system of government?
It's probably unprecedented in what it pretends to be able to do. This is some kind of legislation that we haven't seen in provincial legislatures before, but provincial governments introduce bills in their legislatures all the time.
Not like this, though. We've never seen anything like this before.
Right, so it doesn't mean we have to rush around to some judgment. We don't have to get ahead of our skis on this. Let's hear the voices in Alberta. Let's see ultimately what the legislature of Alberta decides to do with this.
Not like this before. How is this acceptable in Canada? How can we allow this? How can we tolerate this? By the way, that was the same David Cochrane who graciously accepted a bowl of poutine from Justin Trudeau for being a really good CBC journalist, for being a really good propagandist for Justin Trudeau, and for all of his hard work, the Prime Minister gave him a poutine. How embarrassing, how cringeworthy. But perhaps the best example of the legacy media showing their true colors when it came to covering the Alberta Sovereignty Act was when the CBC put together an at-issue panel without one Albertan. They discussed the Alberta Sovereignty Act without having the voice of one Albertan on the panel. Instead, they had Rosemary Barton leading the conversation, the true paragon of journalistic ethics. They had Andrew Antisocial Yob Coyne, and then they had the rest of the CBC panel just there to criticize the Alberta Sovereignty Act without having one Albertan there to defend the act itself. Classic CBC, doing the bidding for their masters and not for the Canadians that pay for their salary.
I mean, she believes a lot of strange things, and it wouldn't be much of a stretch to add this to it. But it's clearly unconstitutional. It clearly involves arrogating to the province powers that it does not have to sit in judgment of federal law, to effectively decide which laws it's going to obey and which laws it's not going to order, not just to not enforce it, but to order everyone in the broader public sector to basically disobey the law, I guess on pain of being found, guilty of obeying the law. It's fantasy land.
It seemed at best amateurs and at worst completely, lacking understanding of how the Constitution works.
Take a look at this Toronto Star op-ed from Althea Raj, who was also on that CBC at-issue panel. Danielle Smith's Sovereignty Act eats at our trust in democracy. Why aren't conservatives calling her out? This past week offered another example of the deficit of truth, honor, and facts in our politics with the introduction of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Oh, give me a break. And from the Toronto Star, no less. What a surprise there. Where were they when the federal government decided to trample all of our rights? Nowhere to be found. They handheld this government while taking money from the taxpayer all throughout COVID. Now they want to come after a province daring to stand up to the federal government. No surprise there. You're nothing but propagandists, nothing but stenographers for the federal government. Now speaking of embarrassing, sad, and pathetic, how about that supposed protest that was supposed to happen at the Alberta legislative grounds? Now the left were expecting thousands of people to protest the Alberta Sovereignty Act outside of the Alberta legislature. And it turns out actually that hardly anyone showed up, and the majority of people that did show up were in favor of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Talk about embarrassing. Could it be perhaps that Albertans are actually in favor of the Sovereignty Act and the legacy media is not telling the truth when they say that, Albertans aren't really on board with this act? Could it be that the legacy media is not telling the truth? Probably not, right? They would never do that. And the surprise attendance of a bunch of Danielle Smith supporting Alberta Sovereignty Act promoting protesters at the supposed anti-Sovereignty Act protest really got under the skin of one protest organizer, Gil McGowan, who's a former NDP candidate. Just look at his meltdown at the protest. Well, that was a cool...
Hey, excuse me. I'm with the Western Standard, isn't it? Hey, isn't this supposed to be a peaceful protest? Isn't it supposed to be a peaceful protest?
Off.
So you're going to tell a news source in Alberta
You're not a news source, you're a propaganda source.
Sir, I disagree with your comments, sir.
I hope you keep your liberal job.
This is supposed to be a peaceful protest.
You.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
That was a flag in the wind.
Yeah, don't touch me.
You're a right-wing authoritarian propaganda news source.
It's supposed
Wear a mask.
It's supposed to be a peaceful protest.
Well, that was a cold dish of reality for those two, wasn't it? I'd be pretty upset too, though, if the legacy media had successfully convinced me that the majority of Canadians, the majority of Albertans were against this Sovereignty Act, because as it appears in that video, and as it appears from what we now know from that sad and pathetic protest, well, it looks like actually Alberta's on board. All right, that's going to do it for us this week on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratio.